Hello and welcome to Responsible Government Contracting. This workshop is part one of a three-part series introducing government contracting. Today, Mr. Andy Bennett will discuss steps necessary to register to do business with the government. Thank you, and find us on the web at nc-rgc.com.
There we go. All right, folks, I am going to have my chat window open. If you have any questions, or feel free to just unmute yourself and chime in. All right, so we are all situated. All right, let's have some fun and dive into government contracting today. My name's Andy Bennett. I'm with National Center of Responsible Government Contracting, and we are going to start to talk about the federal acquisition process, government contracting, and what happens as you go through this process. You should be seeing my slides if I can get a thumbs up or thumbs down if there's any issues with my slides. Just to confirm. Are you guys seeing my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so like I said, my name's Andy, and please chime in if you have any questions, and we will go ahead and get started. Today we're talking about part one, and that's the registration piece. This is a three-part series that we've been doing through HCC, and focusing first on, in part one, registering the companies that you are representing. I'm going to work with you guys through this workshop as if you are business owners, small business owners, or folks thinking about doing business with the federal government. My first step is to kind of give you a lay of the land and understanding of who the people are. We're going to have some fun with some hats, and then go into part two, which is the registration piece. Part three, or the research piece, and then part three, we're going to talk about how to actually do the responses. But for today, the thing that I want to kind of start out with a story is my exposure to this world, to federal contracting, started when I became an officer in the Air Force. Lieutenant Bennett, I was that guy. And in the early 2000s, I had just graduated college and had five enlisted folks working for me right out of the gate. And I knew a bunch of college stuff, but I didn't really know anything to do with the real world, as far as certainly not to do with the acquisitions piece. So I started to learn and research, as leader, and figure out what was going on. I found that my airmen needed certain things, and trying to be, to do what they needed in support of their mission, sometimes that's equipment. And I started to notice after the first couple of years that acquisition process that we'll talk about, that buying season, is really a thing. So what I would start to do is make a wish list. And as a young second lieutenant, I would have the computer monitors, or the new flight suits, or the boots, or whatever it is that my airmen needed. I would have that wish list around the summertime in my pocket at all times. It would have the product that my folks needed. It would have the price per unit, and it would have the website or the vendor where I could go buy that stuff. Now, I didn't have authorization. I didn't have a government credit card or anything like that. So I knew, though, that it's a real thing in federal government that in the July, August, and September timeframe, which we'll talk about more today, contracting officers are going crazy bonkers to clear their accounts to make sure they don't have any money left over as the fiscal year crosses. After this workshop, you might not know at all what I just said, but after this workshop, that's going to make sense. So as a second lieutenant, I had that wish list in my hand when my contracting officers would come around frantically around July and say, "Hey, Andy, do you need anything?" Why, yes, I do. And guess what? Because I was prepared, and because I understood this as an active duty member, I had my troops supplied with what they needed because I had that list and because it was executable by the contracting officers immediately. All right, so this is a workshop today about understanding what pieces of that process are relevant. How do you best prepare yourself and your company, your organization to benefit from that process? And what are those parameters? All right, so that's what we're going to focus on today. Another little vignette about me. The pictures here are from a recent family trip last summer up the East Coast to some of the historical sites. I'm the guy that went to the National Archives and bought a piece of government red tape. So that's enough about me. that should tell you everything you need to know about me. I get a kick out of this stuff. So please ask questions. Please challenge the things that I'm saying. If it doesn't make sense, don't just go by. Please ask questions and please ask me to explain it differently if it doesn't make sense. All right, so off to the races here. As I said, today we're talking about registration. In order to register, I want to give you a little bit of background about the government, about this thing we're talking about in the federal government. There is not just one federal government. There is not just one contracting office that we're dealing with here. This is hundreds and hundreds of little pieces, little agencies, little offices that come together to make this federal government. We have a chain of command. You're going to hear me talk about that term a lot. The president is at the top of that chain of command, then people below them, and so on and so on and so on, down to those offices that are all over the country and all over the world, embassies, military bases, that all buy stuff and they all buy services. So whether you are providing product, materials, equipment, or you're providing professional services, janitorial services, legal services, IT services, the government is almost certainly going to buy your products and services. We all kind of got a sense of civics class and social studies, depending on what years you were in school. When I went to school, civics, it was taught, and it still is, the three branches of government. I'm not going to bore you with that, so don't glaze over. For today's purposes, what we need to know for Congress, for that branch, for the legislative branch, is that they create the budget. So when you hear the purse strings are controlled by Congress or things like that, that's what that means. They create the buckets, the lines of accounting, the chart of accounts, the program codes, the program elements. They create the lines of account that say, yes, you can go spend money on hypersonics. Yes, you can go spend money on building new schools, or whatever those budgetary items are. That's what Congress does. They listen to their constituents, us. They come together and debate and negotiate, and then they come out with that budget. That's their primary job, is to control that budget. Once they send that budget over to the president and the president signs it, now it's the executive branch. That's why it's called the executive branch, because the president is then empowered to go spend that money that Congress authorized them. All right, judicial branch is to just make sure everybody plays within the lines. So today and in part 2 and 3, we're going to be solely focused on the practical application, the practical steps under the executive branch. To give you a sense of where we are talking about, and that's super small on the bottom half there, but just to give you an idea on what these different agencies are, we are talking about, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Treasury, Social Security. This block here is Department of Defense. Okay, so that number, I know it's super small, but that's 14.3% of the federal budget. Veterans Affairs, Department of Education, just to give you a sense of the total federal budget that we're talking about. That number is $9.3 trillion. That's a 9 with a bunch of zeros behind it. Imagine, if you will, I said I was going to speak to you guys as small business owners. I'm a small business owner myself. Imagine, if you will, I use QuickBooks to run, my finances. Imagine if you were to set up QuickBooks for a $9 trillion organization. Your revenues were $9 trillion. That gets messy, that gets complicated, it gets very in the weeds. That's why this red tape, and that's why understanding the process matters a bunch, because there's not just one QuickBooks for the federal government, there are several of those systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Of that 9.3 trillion, about 1.8 trillion is actually buying stuff and buying product, or product and services. I'm going to introduce a term to you guys. It's called NAICS codes. Some may pronounce it NIACS. I pronounce it as NAICS. Same thing, tomato, tomato. What that stands for is North American Industry Classification Code. I'm going to refer to that a lot, so kind of let that sink in. NAICS codes, North American Industry Classification Codes. Why is that important? Because the government has to be able to separate a janitor from a dog groomer, from an IT equipment reseller, from a soybean farmer. So there are over 1,300 of these different classifications, and they're all NAICS codes. They're all 6-digit numbers that classify those types of industries. We're going to come back to that. This graph, this pie chart here, shows you by NAICS code what that money is being spent on. What is the government buying? The blue, this section up here, is manufacturing, making stuff. This orange is professional services, people, services, labor. And then the balance here is a mismatch. You've got everything from utilities to educational services to additional manufacturing. So it's a split. Just to give you an idea of what the government is actually buying. Now let's dive in a little bit more. When? What's that timeline? Right. So remember back to Second Lieutenant Bennett. Over the summertime, every year is when I would have that list ready to go, because I knew that the fiscal year, not the physical, but the financial year, the fiscal year started on October 1st, and it goes through September 30th. So October of 2023 was the start of fiscal year 24. There's a lot of things that are going to not make sense. There's a lot of things that are just crazy bonkers that I'm going to throw out there today. Understanding the fiscal year is one of those key things that you just need to accept. The federal fiscal year starts on October 1st, and it goes through September 30th of the next calendar year. We will talk more about that timeline, but just know that that timeline is a real thing. These charts on the left-hand side here, I can tell you without this goes back to 2008, just to give you a sense. And these are 3 different agencies, okay? And I can tell you exactly on each of these years when September hits. Being a business owner, dealing with public sector in the federal government, you need to be aware that the buying season, the major buying activities happen July, August, September, and it's a ski slope every single year. We're going to talk a little bit more about why that is in a minute. The outlier for this was COVID. So that kind of is the example that proves the rule, if you will, the exception that proves the rule. And September is the end of the fiscal year. That's the takeaway for this. Now let's have some fun. I have been doing this for just over 21 years in different capacities. on the government side and in the commercial sector side, large business and small business. And I've come to see that there are really four types of people that you're going to be dealing with through this process. I refer to them as the four legs of the table. The first one are the finance folks. So who are the finance folks, and why do I talk about them first? Because they're the ones that pay the bills. This is your commercial equivalent. This is your AP, AR, your accounts payable, your accounts receivable. These are the folks behind the scenes. They are not decision makers. They are not deciding who wins and loses contracts. These are the folks who get the bills paid. So when I listen to business owners and I talk to different folks, one of the major complaints that I hear about working with the government and why business owners don't want to work with the federal government is because there's such a pain in the neck to get paid. They slow pay, or it's so much red tape, so much bureaucracy, so much process, all this kind of stuff. It's just a waste of time. It's not worth it. Okay, I respect that. I challenge that though, because the government, again, running that $9 trillion QuickBooks, has to be very, very specific about how to invoice. And if you don't invoice the way that they tell you to, your invoice is going to get rejected. And just like I'd suggest any large organization, there are going to be some folks in that organization that are better at doing the processing than some others, maybe. So in the workflow of approving invoices, there are multiple steps that different government people have to click and say, yep, I got that box delivered. I verify delivery. And then a finance person needs to check a box that says, yep, there's money in that account, go pay that invoice. And if you are not tracking your own invoices and you are not following up with your government customers to make sure, hey, ma'am, sir, I've submitted this invoice. Do you mind going into wider workflow and clicking the approve button? Shame on you. When you win a government contract, I promise you, I have never, ever, ever seen one, and I've seen lots of them. I have never seen a government contract without a phone number and an email address of a finance person listed on the contract, in the contract. As I said, I've been doing this for a minute, and the first invoice on any contract, I still call that finance person on the government side and say, ma'am, sir, appreciate your time. I'd like to just review the invoice, first time invoice, like to make sure that we're doing it per your standards. Give them the opportunity to give you that feedback. Because if you're waiting 30 days, 60 days, 90 days to follow up with them when it's past due, then you're scrambling and your cash flow is already out of whack. Another tidbit here, when we're talking about the finance people, as a small business, we're going to talk a bunch about small businesses. As a small business, you are entitled, per federal law, it's the Small Business Act, or the Prompt Payment Act and the Small Business Act, actually, you are entitled to net 10 terms. So as a small business, you can request from your contracting officer, and they have to approve it, net 10 terms. And if you're a business owner, you know what that means. Typically, you submit the invoice, and then net 30 means 30 days later is when they have to pay you by. They have that 30-day window to pay you. Wouldn't it be nice if you could get paid faster? So by law, the government has net 10 terms just for small businesses. So you submit the invoice, it's accepted, and within 10 days later, they have to pay you, right? So keep that in mind. Finance people are the good guys. They're behind the scenes, and you can ask them for help. Please, please ask them for help. All right. Next up is the commander. I'm going to use commander as the term. This may be the director. This may be the secretary. This may be the agency head. The titles are going to change depending on the group that you're working with, the government person that you're working with. Their commercial equivalent is going to be the president or the CEO, maybe the COO of that company. That's the commander of that organization. The difference is if I'm sitting across the table and negotiating a contract, or I'm trying to sell my widgets and gadgets to the president or CEO of a company, and he or she says, "Yep, Andy, I love what you got. I want to buy. I'm going to sign right now." The president or CEO typically has that authority. They have signature authority for their company, for their organization. They can make that decision on behalf of their organization. In the government, they do not. The commander, it's their job to set direction, to give intent. In the military, that's called mission type orders. So, all right, folks, we're going to go this direction. These are going to be our priorities for this next year, for this next 12-month period. I wear a hat because in Tampa we have Gasparilla. So the captain of the boat, the commander of the boat, the ship is the person in charge. They steer the direction of that ship, of that boat. So the mission type orders, that's the direction. Okay, it's not the buy, it's the direction. When the commander is speaking, it is the end user, a bunch of end users who are listening. The boss talks, the program managers, the end users, the mission partners, the program executive offices, these folks are scribbling down what the boss is talking about. All right, boss, got it. We want to go this direction next year. Understood. It's the end user's job, that operational person's job, to break down the boss's big picture direction into little projects, into actionable projects or buys, that activity. The end user is going to start what's called a needs statement. I need something, a needs statement. That needs statement is where you can start to influence things. If you are in a business where specifications matter, details matter, you're CMMI certified, you're an ISO 9000 certified, you have your specialty degree in whatever, you have your PMP certification, you have a 5-axis manufacturing machine as opposed to a 3-axis machine. You have whatever certification, right? Those are the people, the end users are the people that are going to care about that specification. Example, if I'm an IT reseller, I resell computers, and my major partner is Dell, let's just say. And I know that the Dell laptop for next year is going to have a 15-inch monitor. All right. I also know, because it's my business to know, that my competition, and I'm making this up, guys. Let's just say my competition is HP, and HP makes a 14-inch monitor next year. They're not going to have a 15-inch monitor. As I'm talking, as a business owner, as a salesperson, whomever, as I'm talking to those end users that care about specifications and details, I'm going to make sure that they know that the Dell laptop coming out, the greatest, latest thing, is going to have a 15-inch monitor. Why? Because as that end user starts to develop their needs statement, what their requirements are, they can say, hey, I remember Andy was just talking, he gave me some literature about this Dell 15-inch monitor. I need a 14 inches, this just isn't going to cut it. I need a 15-inch monitor. They're going to specify in their requirements that a 15-inch monitor is required. Now, well, they're not going to be able to say, they have to jump through a lot of hoops if they say a Dell laptop is required. That's a brand name justification. But what they can do is say a 15-inch monitor is required. And that takes off the table anybody who only makes a 14-inch monitor. Okay? So that's the type of conversation that you can have with the end users. All right. So that's why they matter. As the end user is developing that need state, that document, that requirements document, they're going to send that document over to, save the best for last here, the contracting officer. Why are they wearing a crown? If you can see that, yeah. Self-explanatory, right? The contracting officer is wearing a crown because it's their signature that matters. The contracting officer has signature authority, not the commander. The commander cannot sign for a government contract. The contract officer signs for a government contract. So the only ones that can obligate the federal government, said fancy. The end user is going to take that requirement. They're going to develop that requirement and they're going to send it over to the contracting officer. This is the same thing, just shown differently. That contracting officer is going to take that needs statement and make it into a statement of work, a scope of work, a performance work statement. That basically are all the same thing. That document is then going to be published out to companies, industry, us, for competition. All right. That's the competitive process. We're going to go into more detail, but that's the big picture. We talked about how the end users care about specifications, details, that type of nitty-gritty, subject matter expertise. Contract officers care about risk. They really care about two things. They care about risk and they care about small business. It is such a big deal in the federal government that there are only two types of businesses. There are small businesses and there are other than small business, OTSB. It's not even called large. It's not even called mid-size. There's nothing formally, as far as the federal government's concerned, that's called the large business. It's small business and OTSB, other than small, everybody else. It's also federal, not regulation, not policy, it's law, the Small Business Act, and it has been for decades and decades and decades. I know there's a lot of news going on right now with diversity and whatnot. Set that aside. Small businesses, as I'm explaining it, have been in law for decades and decades and decades. So this is not a new thing. 23.7% of the federal acquisitions budget has to be spent on small businesses, total small businesses. I'm going to answer that next question. What is a small business? Hold that close. 5% of that large budget has to be spent with minority-owned companies. A different 5% has to be spent with woman-owned companies. A different 3% with veteran-owned small businesses, and a different 3% with hub zone, historically underutilized business zones. It's the contracting officer that cares about that kind of thing. So if you're having conversations with a contracting officer, which you're totally allowed to, I'll tell you when to stop that. You need to make sure that they know your small business status and your small business certifications. Risk was the other thing that I said. You also need to make sure that the contracting officer knows that you've been there, done that, got the t-shirt. I have past performance that is relevant to this work. We've done this before. We have confidence. We have a system in place, yada, yada, right? The contracting officer wants to make sure that they're not going to get a defunct company or have somebody default on the contract because it's their neck on the line. All right. So risk and small business utilization. That's kind of paramount for contracting officers. So you can see each of these legs of the table is really focused on different aspects of the conversation. As a business owner, you're going to be having conversations with all of those folks. And each of them may tell you something slightly different. Oh yeah, you're going to get, we've already done the selection. We're notifying you that you're going to get the contract. You should get that in a week or two. Well, if it's an end user that's telling you that, maybe they're right, but you can't take their word for it. It's the contracting officer that has the authority to make that announcement and has the authority to have that conversation with you. All right. So you only want to be taking the word of, formally taking the word of the contracting officer. And this just kind of gives you an idea of how the government teaches itself. So this is a slide from AFIT, Air Force Institute of Technology. It's a kind of a community college within the Air Force for Air Force people. This is a slide that talks about this acquisition process from them. So give them full, I did not create this. This is full credit to AFIT. But this gives you an idea, kind of insight into what the federal government uses to teach their own folks about this process that we're talking about. All right, dive in a little bit more to the small business piece. That $1.8 trillion that I showed earlier, not the whole, unfortunately, not the whole 9 trillion, because a lot of that goes to Social Security, a lot of that goes to payroll, a lot of that goes to other, Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of thing. But almost $2 trillion goes to this total pie that we're talking about. About a quarter of that goes to small businesses, 23.7%. And 5%, 5%, 3%, 3%, like I said. Okay, Andy, that's great. Percentages are wonderful. That sounds like a lot, but what does that actually look like? Okay, so last fiscal year, the dollars, the contracted awarded funds that went to total small businesses was $148 billion. That's a big number. 148, almost $150 billion. Minority-owned companies at about $20 billion, woman-owned companies about $25 billion, HubZone about 14 billion, and veteran-owned companies about 30 billion. Now, if you're an African-American woman, you potentially qualify on its face at least two categories. Each contract can only be awarded under one of these small business categories. So if you're a business that qualifies under multiple small business certifications, then you may be getting contracts in multiple of these, of these buckets. So you may get contracts under that 24 billion and contracts under that 19 billion. If you're an African-American male veteran, then you may qualify for those two small business certifications. So you have to know the ownership of your company. There's lots of regulations around that. The disadvantaged individual, so the woman, the veteran, the minority, has to own at least 51% of the company. There's some income requirements, minimum thresholds kind of thing. And no kidding, have to be day-to-day control and long-term decision-making for the company. You cannot be just a figurehead for the company. Don't mess around with that, guys. They know what they're doing. They look for it. You're going to go through a process of approval. Make sure you know the requirements for those certifications. But there's huge benefit to that. Contract officers have huge discretion and authority. Contract officers can write contracts for up to $4.5 million. It takes about 2 weeks to sole source, meaning there's no competition, sole source to you under this regulation. Huge benefit. So if you qualify and the strategy makes sense, I recommend looking at the Small Business Administration, SBAs, the Small Business Administration, small business certifications, because that will help you through this process. Now, let's kind of dive into that fiscal year spending pattern a little bit more. And guys, please don't wait for me to ask. If you have questions, I'm keeping an eye on my chat, and feel free to hop in. If anything that I know I'm throwing a lot at you right now, but please, please, please ask questions as things don't make sense. Okay. If I have 3 different agencies, 3 different government offices, and we're just going to look at them 1, 2, and 3. And last year, this agency got $100 for their budget for the year. At the end of the year, September 30th, they had $20 left in their bank account. They only spent $80. This next excuse me, this next agency, federal agency, had $100 in their budget, and they had zero left in their bank account after the year, September 30th. They spent all $100. And these guys over here, this agency spent over their budget. They overspent their budget by 20%. Okay. What happens to these folks in a regular business, in a commercial business? Well, number one here gets a bonus because they got the job done. All of these folks got the job done. But dude here probably gets a bonus because they saved, 20% of their budget, and everybody's jumping in the streets because they can carry that over to next year. They were efficient, whatever the reason. The middle lady here, she's okay. She gets congratulations, you did what you were supposed to do. The third folks here, they're probably getting fired because they overspent their budget. They spent more than they were allocated, and that's probably putting a strain on cash flow and all sorts of bad stuff. Crazy bonkers. I understand. The government is exactly opposite. If you are this first agency and come next year when you're asking for your new budget, you're going to ask for the same budget that you had last year. You're going to ask for $100. But Congress is not going to authorize you $100, or your headquarters is not going to authorize you $100. You're going to get $80 because you wasted taxpayer dollars last year and left $20, which, because the budget from Congress is a 12-month thing, that money now expires and we can't do anything with it. You've wasted taxpayer dollars. Cardinal sin in government. This lady is getting a promotion, getting a huge hug because she is tracking exactly to the penny what she's supposed to be doing. So she's awesome. She's doing what she's supposed to be doing. These guys is where it starts to get crazy, because although their commercial counterpart is getting fired, they're growing because that agency did such an amazing job that so many additional taxpayers and citizens benefit from that mission, from that job, whatever it was, from that program that they were doing, that they had to grow by 20%. So heck, let's throw some more funding at it because it did such a great job, and we'll let it grow next year. So they're going to get a plus up. They're going to get additional funding next year. I know this sounds crazy, guys, but this is how it works. And I've had contracting officers on these workshops, and they're just laughing because they're like, Andy, you nailed it. Pay attention to this. That's why I go into detail about this, so that you can understand it and understand how these conversations go. We're going to talk more about it. I'm going to go into the actual registration step next, but I want to just kind of close out this piece of it. We're going to take what we've talked about here and expand upon it in part 2, which is the researching phase, and how do you actually research and find those opportunities. But before you're able to do the research phase, you've got to register. And that registration, if you already have a company, what did you do to set up this company? Well, you had to go to the IRS and get a taxpayer number. You had to get a tax ID, a TIN, EIN. You also had to go to the state, the Secretary of the state of Florida, Secretary of State of Georgia, wherever, and register and file your articles of organization, articles of incorporation with them, and pay taxes, right? So pay your registration license. That's great. And you also have to do that here, but there are some additional steps you have to do. So step 1 is register with the state that you're primarily operating in. I'm in the state of Florida. I register my business in the state of Florida. That's what their website looks like. It's the Secretary of State of Florida, not the federal Secretary of State, but the actual Secretary of State of Florida. And if you're not sure of your Secretary of State's website and you Google it and you don't find it, you can go to this one. It's the National Association of Secretaries of State, and it will pull down and you pick your state, and it will take you to that, to your Secretary of State's website. Go through the filing process. This is the only step you have to pay for. Let me say that again. This is the only step you have to pay for. Guys like me are out there and we will help you through this process and we will charge you for that support, but you don't have to. There are P-tax, they don't call them P-tax anymore. They're called Small Business Development Centers, SBDCs, and Apex Accelerators. Apex Accelerators, they are both there. They are small business administration folks that are there to help you through this process, right? And they're free. So you go to the Secretary of State website and you pay. In Florida, it's $125, I think it is. In Georgia, I think it's $200, whatever it is for that. That's the only step that you actually have to pay for. And then the renewal every year, you have to pay that filing fee. Once you do that, then you have to go to the IRS. Louisiana is the opposite. You have to do the IRS first, and then you do Secretary of State of Louisiana. So depending on the state that you're operating in, the sequence might change. So you go to the IRS, you don't have to pay for this, but you do have to sign over your firstborn, and you get a tax ID number. They're going to send you, you do it digitally. So they will either email you or they can mail it to you, a form. It's an SS4, and that has your taxpayer ID number. That is the social security number for your company. So you want to make sure you keep that, you don't share that with everybody. That taxpayer ID, that TIN, EIN, and they're interchangeable. I haven't heard anybody convincing me that one is super different than the other, but those terms you'll hear EIN, TIN back and forth. So that number you're going to need. Food for thought, pro tip. I'm going to save you 2 months in this process right here, right now. Make darn sure you use the same mailing address, you use the same name, everything to the spacing, to the capitalization, to the period matches. If you are 123 Main Street with the Secretary of State, don't do 123 Main ST for the IRS. Make sure it all matches exactly. And don't use PO boxes. The federal guys, when we get to this next step, they don't like PO boxes. So don't waste your time. Suite numbers. So if you go to like a FedEx Kinko's or something like that, they'll give you a suite number. That's fine. They also recently do not like co-working spaces. So the WeWorks, there's a bunch of them, but that type of address. Because what's going to happen is the databases, once you put in that address, that database is going to match the Secretary of State that you told them, I registered in Florida, whatever. It's going to match against the IRS, and it's going to match against the United States Postal Service. Guess what? They work for the federal government. So all those databases are going to instantly check the addresses. And if they don't line up, you've got a problem. If they do line up, but other companies are listed as the owner of that property, you've got a problem. So you need to make sure that your company is listed as that address, whichever address you're providing them, and it's consistent through the process. Last note on this step is I see some people getting hung up with registered agents. You are not using your registered agent's address if you used one. You're using your company headquarters address as we go through this process, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. The next step, Dunn's number, Dun & Bradstreet, D&B, all the same thing. You don't have to do this anymore. You can, it's free if you go to the website or you Google search Dun & Bradstreet for government contracting. They will give you a Dun & Bradstreet number for free for your company, but you don't have to do this anymore. They changed this rule and it's now called a unique entity ID, and you get that in a step that we'll talk about here in a second. So you can skip over that one. Some contracting officers still ask for the DUNS number. You can give them the UEI, the unique entity ID instead, but it doesn't cost you anything to get it, so you might as well get a DUNS number also. All right, so now we get to the different part. All that you basically had to do when you registered any company, a commercial company. Now, this is the stuff that you have to do for a federal contractor, okay? So this website is secure.login.gov. You're going to go here, to create an account, and this is going to be very, very invasive. So understand that going into it. They actually ask for a picture of the front and back of your driver's license. That is normal. Just make sure you're on a site. I'm going to show you the live links, but make sure you're on a site that looks like this. Be very, very sure you're on a site that looks like this. This is the actual website here. So you're going to create that account. You're going to create that profile for your, not your company, but for yourself. You're going to use that login for a lot of different websites. So you have to create the login first. I'm going to come back to this one. Once you do that, then you're going to go to sam.gov. Think Uncle Sam, S-A-M, sam.gov, G-O-V for government. Sam.gov is going to look like this. And there's a bunch of sites out there that are very, very convincing. So make sure you're on a website that looks like this. And I'm actually going to show you through this next step. And I'm going to show you what the rest of the process looks like. Immediately after you finish that registration, Sam is going to give you a unique entity ID. It's a long sequence. It's a UEI. That is going to happen seconds as you do this, okay? The thing that takes longer is the cage code. Commercial and government entity they were stretching there for a second. That's what CAGE stands for. So CAGE code is that 5-digit alphanumeric number, the CAGE code that is your, golden ticket to do business with the federal government. All right, so now let's go to what these actual websites look like. We're going to go to the next page. We'll do that next class, actually, next workshop. All right, so this is sam.gov. This is what the homepage, sam.gov, should look like. Feel free to screenshot it. I'm going to put the recording of this up on my website and in a couple of days, so you can feel free to come back and look at it. This is the website that you're wanting to go to. When you go here for the first time, you can do sign in. So click that sign in button, accept this, accept. And let's say you don't already have, so you're going to create, and this is that signin.gov account that I was just showing you in that previous step. So you're going to create an account, and then you're just going to follow the steps, right? So I'm not going to do that now because, you can do this on your own, but just create an account and it's going to walk you through. This is actually pretty straightforward. This isn't, cryptic or anything. So this is pretty straightforward. Follow through this and make sure you do that account, create that account. I have already created that account, my account. So I'm going to click, my email address and password, and I'm going to sign in. Just like banking, you have to do two-factor authentication. My two-factor authentication is one of those apps on my phone. So for the next 30 seconds or so, that's my token. And it resets, so you have to type it in relatively quickly. And then you get to a page that looks like this. Yours is going to look a little bit different than mine because this is what I do, but you're going to look at something like this workspace. That's where you're going to default to. You are going to go to home. All I did was click on home here. Let me zoom in a little bit. And right over here where it says register your entity is just their way of saying company, business. You're going to register and say get started. When you do this, it's going to walk you through the process. I'm going to go through a couple of these just to kind of show you. Okay, reading, sure. Yep, sounds good. Get started. So select get started and create new entity. All right, so I'm going to create a new entity. I want to do business directly with the federal government, and I'm doing it because I want to bid on contracts. Prime contractor just means you're the one that has the direct relationship with the government. Sure. And you can say, I don't know, but I just put, bid on contracts. Next. Okay, who is requiring you? Well, you can put Andy if you want to. But you can put, I decided to do it on my own. You can put federal government, whatever fits your situation. This isn't going to hold you to anything hard and fast. Excuse me. Next, this is where you need to pay attention. If you're doing grants, you may only need your UEI, your unique entity ID. If you're going for contracts, you need to do a cage code. You need to do, I know it's a lot more, but you need to do your cage code. So that's this one over here. So select that. I'm going to show you one particular step that I don't want you, this one here. I've seen people mess this up. So pay attention to what you're clicking. Don't just click through this stuff because it's very particular questions. Are you registering a government entity? Likely not, unless you are the Hillsborough County representative or municipality, city of Tampa or whatever it is. You are a company, so you are not a government entity. So you say no. And if you are physically located, again, with that address in the United States, then you do that. All right. So as you progress through these questions, eventually it's going to get to a point where it starts looking like that other screen, right? So this blue screen here, and that's fine. You're going to start going through those questions, and it will ask you for a bank account. So go ahead and have that set up. It will ask you for the routing number and the account number for that bank account. That is because they're getting all of those, crossing the T's and dotting the I's out of the way for paying you when you do the registration. All of that's getting set up front, so you don't have to worry about it later to delay you getting paid. That is the registration. That is federal government registration for you as an entity. I am going to turn it over to you guys for questions. I want to thank you if you need to drop off. I appreciate it. That's my information there if you want to scan that QR. But let me open it up to you guys for questions. Anything not make sense? Anything you want to dive into a little bit more? We've got a couple of minutes.
This was great, Andy.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
So when is part two? When is the part two workshop?
All right. You can find it through the same Eventbrite
Okay.
that you found this one, but let me show you. I'll put a little plug in here since you asked. If you go to events on my page, you can see the upcoming stuff. So part two is going to be on the 17th, and I'll put this link here in the chat. So if you click on this RSVP, it'll take you to the registration page on the Eventbrite, or you can just do the registration through Zoom, either way. But the next one, part two, is on the 17th, and then part three is going to be on the 24th. And when we set up February, they'll be here also. Next question, okay. Will we get a recording? So on courses on my website, it's loading. Oh, well, it's there. Let's do, there we go. You are watching, or you are participating in part one. So any of these seminars that say part one, that's going to be, I'm going to load this one. Give me a day or so, guys. But I keep these updated, and you can look at previous ones. You can look at, other parts, kind of read ahead. But this is where it's going to be, and I'll put this link in the chat also. All right, guys. I appreciate everyone. If there's no other questions, I look forward to seeing you guys on part two.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for your time today. We hope this workshop was instructive and informative. Please find additional accredited courses and other support services on our website at nc-rgc.com